everyone, I'm Kay. Welcome to ArtBookNook, where I share my collection of art and craft books with you. Today I'm going to review 15-minute Watercolor Florals by Joly Poa. I've been asked to review this book by Page Street Publishing, and I'm really excited to share it with you because I've been an admirer of Joly's for quite a long time. I've admired her style of painting. She's a self-taught watercolour artist, and she's very well known on social media. She has 40 classes on Skillshare and a huge following on YouTube, so you've probably heard of her. But this is Joly's first book, and it was a real thrill and a real privilege to be asked to review this. It came with this lovely letter, and together, I think I'm holding this up the right way, together with this set of paints. I've not come across this make before. It's Prang. I'm going to enjoy swatching them out, and it also came with, I'll just show you the paints if you can see them. So I'll swatch those out, and it also came with a couple of paintbrushes, one of which is this. It's a deerfoot, Princeton deerfoot. I've not used a paintbrush shaped quite like this before, so I'm really looking forward to following one of Joly's tutorials and sharing it with you and letting you know how I get on. So without further ado, I'm going to show you the structure of Joly's book and also the projects, and then I shall have a go myself. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I hope you enjoy the review. The book is divided into 6 clear sections, beginning with materials, brush control, colour and basic floral techniques, followed by 30 step-by-step projects, beginning with individual flowers before culminating at the end in several lovely creative projects. In the introduction, Joly describes herself as self-taught and says that many of her early paintings began as little more than colourful blobs. She's designed her book to make the process of painting florals in watercolour feel less intimidating, beginning with basic materials and techniques before moving on to the projects. Floral painting has given Joly the freedom to explore colour, movement and expressive brushstrokes. She hopes you will enjoy her lovely book, discover the joy of slowing down and find your own unique style. Joly begins by sharing her top 10 tips to help you paint loose florals, such as leaving white space, blotting your brush and using a hairdryer or fan to speed up painting time. In the materials section, Joly explains the differences between paper surfaces and weights. She then looks at the brushes she uses to create those loose petals, fine lines and textured details. And although she prefers artist-grade paints, Joly makes it clear that beginners can start with more affordable materials and upgrade gradually. Oh, and she explains what she uses the deerfoot brush for. One of her signature tools is the surikomi brush, which she discovered in an art shop in Japan. The deerfoot brush is similar apparently, and it's the one she uses to create sort of a dotted texture in small areas. When I film one of Joly's step-by-step projects for you, I must make sure it's one that uses the deerfoot brush. This section explains one of the most important aspects of watercolour, controlling the balance between paint and water. Joly shows you how a brush can be too wet, just right or almost dry, and how each creates a different effect. She then demonstrates 3 paint consistencies, thick, medium and light, which can be used to create contrast and depth within a flower. The darker, thicker paint is suited to centres and stronger details, while the lighter mixtures create softer, more translucent petals. Joly first explains the different parts of a brush and how the way you hold it affects the result. Holding it nearer the ferrule gives you more control, while holding it further back encourages looser, more expressive strokes. She then introduces a series of simple brush drills using the tip, half of the brush, the full belly and the side. These exercises create fine lines, broader petals, leaves and varied thick and thin strokes. The filbert brush is also demonstrated for rounded petals and longer, more tapered shapes. Her main message here is that regular practice will help you build control, confidence and muscle memory until the brush begins to feel more like a natural extension of your hand. The next step is to learn the basic strokes that form the foundation of loose watercolour florals. These are the same techniques that Joly has developed over the years, and include comma, C and S shaped strokes, rounded and ruffled petals, and fine lines for adding veins and detail. She also demonstrates stamping techniques and several simple ways to create leaves, from single and double strokes to more elongated and expressive shapes. The watercolour techniques section begins with Joly explaining wet on dry for sharper, more controlled edges, and wet on wet for softer blooms and gentle colour transitions. She also demonstrates splattering to add movement and texture. Joly then looks at fading one edge of a stroke, allowing two wet colours to bleed together, adding white details for highlights, and pulling darker pigment from the centre of a flower to create depth and definition. Together, these opening lessons form what Joly calls her Watercolor Floral Toolkit. She completes this with a short section on floral composition. Joly explains how focal flowers, secondary blooms, fillers and foliage can be combined to create balance and variety, and suggests using a clear focal point, odd numbers and a mixture of shapes and sizes. She also looks at contrast, colour balance and the direction of the arrangement, illustrating how changes in height, flowing lines and darker shadow leaves can help guide the viewer's eye through the painting and give the composition a greater sense of movement. This brings us to the end of Joly's Watercolour Floral Toolkit. The remainder of her book is devoted to the individual projects, so I'll show you how the step-by-step projects are structured, and also share with you the range of flowers and compositions Joly has included. Oh, look how pretty this is. Oh, I really like this. I love roses, and this is so delicate. It's just gorgeous. I can see some lovely wet in wet techniques and soft blends. Before you begin, Joly makes the reassuring point that every rose you paint will be one of a kind and may look slightly different from hers. Although painting roses can appear challenging, she guides you through the process step by step. As someone who generally paints landscapes, what I particularly appreciate is that Joly not only recommends the paint colours and the exact brush type and size, but also identifies the floral strokes you'll be using. I think this is very helpful because personally I would be very tempted to practice those strokes first before starting the project itself. We'll use C-shaped strokes throughout this project, and the instructions are presented as a clearly numbered sequence of photographs accompanied with concise written explanations. Joly begins at the centre of the rose with small concentrated marks, gradually widening the petals as she works outwards. She then introduces a second colour, allowing it to bleed gently into the first to create soft two-toned leaves, before adding a second layer to give the flower greater depth. Throughout the tutorial, Joly also explains the paint consistency needed at each stage and how to load your brush. We're now going to look through the remaining projects in Joly's lovely book. They all follow the same clear structure, with a finished painting, recommended materials, key brushstrokes identified, and numbered photographic steps. But I won't be showing you every step-by-step page. I'll just show you the finished paintings for each project and briefly comment on what's included. I hope you'll stay with me because afterwards I'll briefly swatch the paints out that I was kindly sent and have a go at one of the projects myself, and you can see how I get on. The remaining individual flower projects explore a range of shapes and techniques. The peony focuses on soft overlapping petals. The poppy encourages broader brushstrokes, wet on wet colour and leaving small areas of white paper. The ranunculus develops control through layered C-shaped marks, while the dahlia uses longer curved strokes to build movement. The hellebore and scabiosa introduce softer colour transitions, fine veins and textured centres. The stock is very useful for practising repeated clustered petals, the gerbera for elongated strokes radiating from a central point, and the sweet pea for loose, ruffled shapes and gentle blends. Together, These projects offer lots of practice in brush pressure, layering, colour control and keeping the flowers expressive rather than overly precise. The Dainty Pairings section consists of 5 projects and shifts the focus to smaller filler flowers and how they can work together in a balanced arrangement. These projects practice combining contrasting shapes from rounded buttercups and 5-petaled blooms to tall lavender stems, airy Queen Anne's lace and tiny clustered flowers. The main skills are controlling fine brushstrokes, varying height and spacing, building light texture through dots and small marks, and using colour and foliage to link the different elements into one harmonious composition. The Floral Wreath section develops composition rather than individual flower shapes. Joly explores full circles, half moons and more open designs, showing how to repeat leaves and small flowers around a curved guide while varying their size, direction and spacing. These projects practice building a balanced rhythm, creating a clear focal area, leaving intentional gaps and combining delicate fillers with stronger blooms. The gold wreath also introduces a more decorative finish, while the rustic version uses warmer colours and looser marks for a less formal effect. The floral bouquet projects bring together everything we've practised earlier, but with more emphasis on composition, movement and balance. Joly explores several arrangements, including a loose hand-tied bouquet, a diagonal spray, a compact spring bouquet and a heart-shaped design. The key skills are all about choosing a focal flower, supporting it with smaller blooms and fillers, and varying the height and direction and using colour accents to guide the viewer's eye. These projects will also encourage you to combine different flower shapes without losing that light, loose quality. This final project section turns Joly's floral techniques into practical personalised projects, such as arranging flowers around a letter to create a floral monogram. You could even extend the idea to spell out an entire name. There are also floral bookmarks and frames which would make lovely handmade gifts for family and friends. Joly shares that she hand-painted all the envelopes for her own wedding invitations, which presented the added challenge of working on a different surface and adjusting the amount of water in the paint. Now it's your turn to create your own signature floral piece, using the techniques you've learned from Joly to combine the flowers and colour palette that inspire you the most. Joly concludes by describing this final project as a reflection of your own journey into loose floral watercolour. I have to say that I'm personally delighted with Joly's very pretty book. The depth of content is really impressive, and what particularly appeals to me is the idea of loose floral watercolour, as it takes away some of the pressure to produce a precise botanical illustration. There are several projects here that I especially like. I'm drawn to the looser bouquets and the softer pink and green colour palettes, while the floral monogram and hand-painted envelope are ideas that I would genuinely like to try for myself. They would make lovely thoughtful gifts. As I mentioned at the beginning, I mainly paint landscapes in oils, pastel and collage, so floral subjects are quite new to me. That makes me all the more interested to try one of Joly's tutorials and see how I get on. Before I decide which project to attempt, I'm going to make a few quick swatches of the paints Page Street Publishing very kindly sent me with the book, and that will give me a chance to see how the colours behave and help me to choose both the project and the palette I'd like to use. I've included links to Joly's book in the description below, should you wish to take a closer look for yourself. So do stay with me, because I'm curious to see whether the instructions are as approachable in practice as they appear on the page, and whether my first attempt at a floral watercolour resembles a flower by the end. I'll begin by making a few quick swatches of the Prang watercolours Page Street Publishing kindly sent with Joly's book. I just want to see how the colours behave and decide whether I'd like to use these for the project I'm going to try. I haven't come across this brand before, but I've discovered that these are student grade paints. And of course I'll be trying out the deerfoot brush as well, but when I was gathering my supplies together, I discovered I already owned one. Honestly, you couldn't make it up. Over the years, I've accumulated so many art supplies, I've actually lost track of what's hiding in my stash. I'm wondering how many of you are the same, or is it just me? If you're wondering, the project I've chosen to tackle is the Sunset Orange Gerbera. I selected it partly because it uses the deerfoot brush and partly because it looks like a fairly easy project for me to begin with, because I usually paint in oils, pastels and collage, so I'm still very much a beginner when it comes to handling watercolour paint. I understand colour mixing, values and composition, but the behaviour of watercolour paint itself is much less familiar to me. So I'll be approaching this project as a watercolour beginner, which should give me a useful way to judge just how clear and practical Joly's instructions are. What do you think to this? It's called a Masterson rinse well. I've had this for more than 40 years. It's a really clever little system. The water sits in this shallow well while you rinse your brush, and when it becomes dirty, you simply press the button, and the dirty water drains into the container bin underneath, and then clean water automatically flows back in from the bottle reservoir. I love it. It saves you from constantly getting up to fetch clean water, and as I said, after 40 years, mine's still going strong. I've linked to this in the description below should you fancy one for yourself. Right, let's quickly swatch these Prang watercolours. I've no idea what the individual colours are, as they don't appear to be named. I've also got some kitchen paper beside me so I can blot my brush. A useful tip is to blot away any excess water before touching the paper, as an overloaded brush can release a sudden puddle and make it much harder to control the strength and spread of the colour. You still want the brush damp and loaded with paint, just not dripping. First I'll give the paints a light spritz of water to soften and activate them before I begin. I'm using my Beechmore sketchbook for this. It measures 8 by 8 inches and contains 160 GSM paper, which is suitable for most media, which is one of the reasons I like it. I also prefer working in a square format. It has a useful ribbon marker, an elastic band to keep the pages together, and a pocket at the back for storing loose notes and other bits and pieces. The pages are perforated, so should you happen to create a masterpiece, you can remove it neatly and frame it. And best of all, it lays completely flat. I'll include a link in the description below for you. Well, this seems to be a fairly muted teal or viridian colour. So the next colour looks like a dark brown, a bit like Van Dyke brown. It doesn't seem to be quite as strongly pigmented as the first colour. And I'm not able to pull the wash out as far before it begins to lose its strength. I continued in the same way with the remaining colours, beginning with a stronger application and then pulling out each one with clean water to see how far the pigment would travel. So here are all 8 colours together. They produce a useful basic palette, but the pigment strength does vary from colour to colour. Some create a reasonably strong wash, while others become quite pale. For practice or a beginner wanting an inexpensive set, I think they're perfectly usable, but for the project itself, I think I'll use my artist quality paints. That way I can concentrate on testing Joly's instructions rather than trying to compensate for weaker colour. As I mentioned earlier in the review, Joly has structured each project so that you can see at a glance exactly which materials, colours and techniques you'll be using. For the Sunset Orange Gerbera, the suggested colours are sap green, permanent yellow light, vermilion, burnt sienna and permanent rose. I already know that I don't have all of those exact colours, but Joly reminds us that it's perfectly fine to use the closest alternatives we already own, so that's what I'll be doing. She recommends a 1 centimetre approximately filbert brush for the rounded petals and a deerfoot brush for the flower centres. You could also use a size 2 round brush or even an old toothbrush for the centres instead. A pencil and a little white gouache may also be useful, although both are optional. What I particularly appreciate is that Joly identifies the learning objectives for each project. In this case, I'll be practising how to layer the petals to build volume. She also lists the floral strokes required, which is especially helpful for me as a novice floral watercolour painter, because it gives me the opportunity to practice those marks before I tackle the finished project. The colours I've selected from my own palette are Daniel Smith Sap Green, with Winsor & Newton, Winsor Lemon, Winsor Red, Burnt Sienna and Permanent Rose. So the Sap Green and Permanent Rose match Joly's suggestions exactly, while the others are close alternatives to the colours she recommends. I've also added Daniel Smith Quinacridone Magenta, which may be useful for deepening or cooling some of the pinks as I work. I like using these lightweight plastic palettes because they're easy to transport and they don't cost very much. I've quite a few of them. I always include a small swatch card so I know exactly which colours are in each palette, and I arrange them in groups of cool, earth and warm colours. I've started with a clean palette for Joly's project and I've only added the colours that I will need. Before starting the painting, I spent some time practising the petal strokes Joly illustrates in the book, so I returned to the page where she explains this technique in more detail. I'll spare you all 14 painful minutes of this by speeding things up for you. Joly recommends using a filbert brush, and to my horror, I discovered that out of my vast collection of watercolour brushes, I own precisely one, just one. The rest are mainly rounds and flats. The good news is, that the filbert I do have is exactly the right size, 1 centimetre. I felt as though I'd won the lottery. I quickly discovered that the paint consistency needed to be just right, and that was really a matter of trial and error, because the type of paper you use will affect how readily it accepts the paint. For some reason, I kept flicking the brush as I lifted it at the end of each stroke. Nowhere does Joly suggest doing this, but when I'm painting, my patience seems to disappear out of the window. Once I slowed down and got a grip of myself, as Joly describes, the technique is to use the side of the filbert brush, pressing down firmly at the beginning of the stroke, then drag gently while gradually reducing the pressure and lifting the brush from the paper slowly. So I got the hang of it. Out of curiosity, I also tried a number 8 flat brush and a number 6 round brush just to see what would happen, but the petals didn't look nearly as convincing as they did with the filbert. I also experimented with the deerfoot brush and I found this relatively easy. The trick there was to just use paint straight from the tube and make sure there wasn't too much of it on your brush. That worked really well. This exercise was well worth the time I spent on it, and I learned a valuable lesson. Practising the suggested brushstrokes before beginning the project really does make a difference. Here is a close-up of my floral petal practice. At the top are my first attempts with the filbert brush, where I kept flicking it away at the end of each stroke. But once I slowed down and placed each mark more carefully, I began to get the hang of the technique. In the centre, you can see how much squarer the petals looked when I used a flat brush, while the round brush below that was quite frankly something of a disaster. I then practised a little more with the filbert before adding a few notes to remind myself what I'd learned, because in a few weeks' time I'll probably have forgotten the entire episode. Now for the exciting part, on to the actual painting. I began by marking out roughly where I wanted each flower to appear on the paper. Then, following Joly's step-by-step photographs and instructions, I moved on to the first stage. Using the deerfoot brush and sap green, I picked up a little paint and dabbed away the excess on a tissue. I then stippled the brush onto the paper to create the textured centre of the flower. Because this is a practical test within my book review, rather than a full real-time tutorial, I don't think you need to watch every dab of my brush. Otherwise, you may all be admiring the same flower centre well into your retirement. So in certain sections, I will speed these up for you. After rinsing the brush and blotting it again on the tissue, I switched to yellow and stippled around the green centre to form a ring, allowing the yellow and green dots to blend naturally together. I really enjoyed using the deerfoot brush. I found it easy and it was fun. Step 2 was to add the first layer of petals to the main flower. I mixed several slightly different shades of orange, then began laying down the petals, rotating my sketchbook as I worked, so that I could approach each stroke from a comfortable angle, without contorting my wrist. Notice how carefully I'm applying the paint to create the petals in real time. I discovered later that contorting my wrist was probably a good thing. So this is the first layer of petals complete. Once it was dry, I added more petals into the gaps to make the flower look fuller and more layered. As Joly suggested, I varied the colour and value of the paint mixture as I worked, trying to introduce a little more depth and variety. With hindsight, I don't think I left quite enough space between the petals in that first layer, which made it slightly harder to fit the second layer in. The pink side-facing flower has more of an oval shape. For this one, I used permanent rose, varying the values again as I worked by adding a touch of Windsor red to the mixture to give a little more interest and variety. Joly suggests lightly drawing the oval shape in pencil first as a guide. Once again, however, my impatience got the better of me and I decided to go for it freestyle. This was not my wisest decision, and I was not particularly happy with the shape of my pink flower. Ever the optimist, I convinced myself I could improve it when I added the second layer of petals. Somehow, though, that didn't quite happen. To add a little more variety to the composition, the next step was to paint a flower facing away from us, so the centre wouldn't be visible. I decided to follow Joly's example and use yellow for this one. By this stage, I'd started to get into the rhythm of painting the petals, so I found this flower relatively easy to complete. I added the flower stems in sap green. I was not entirely pleased with the angles, as they looked slightly off to me, and once again, a light pencil guide would no doubt have helped. Finally, Joly suggested deepening the flower centres with the deerfoot brush, using a mixture of equal parts burnt sienna and vermilion. I used Windsor red in place of the vermilion. To finish, I added a few tiny dots of paint to the very centre of each flower with the No. 2 round brush. When I compared my painting with Joly's example, I was disappointed with my first attempt. My Gerberas looked rather stiff and rigid, anything but a loose floral interpretation. But rather than leave it there, I decided to try the exercise a few more times, applying what I'd learned from that first attempt. For my second effort, I stopped rotating the sketchbook as I painted, and instead I adjusted the angle of my wrist. By the third attempt, I finally produced something I was happy with. I was especially pleased because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm really a landscape painter and I usually work in mediums other than watercolour, so this was something quite new for me. I do enjoy a challenge, apparently even when I create half of it myself. So what did I learn? Firstly, the type of brush really does matter. The floral stroke exercises and techniques in the first part of Joly's book are well worth spending time on, even if you are selective and practice only the strokes needed for a particular project. I also learn that it pays to follow the recipe. I'm a devil for going off-piste and doing my own thing. A chef once told me, that you should follow a recipe exactly the first time you make it and only start experimenting afterwards. It turns out the same advice applies to painting. So does Joly's book live up to its promise of creating watercolour florals in 15 minutes? I think it does. And in case you're wondering, my final attempt only took 9 minutes. That was probably because I'd stopped trying so hard to be precise. Instead, I simply let the brush dance across the paper and I enjoyed the process. So after looking through the book and trying one of the projects for myself, what do I think of 15-minute watercolour florals? I think Joly has created a very approachable introduction to loose floral painting. The book is clearly organised, the step-by-step photographs are easy to follow, and the projects offer plenty of variety without feeling overwhelming. What I particularly liked was that the technique section at the beginning genuinely supports the projects that follow. The brushstroke exercises are not simply there to fill a few pages before the interesting part begins. They really do help you understand how the different brushes behave and how the flowers are constructed. As my first attempt demonstrated rather efficiently, it does help to follow Joly's instructions. The projects may look loose and spontaneous, but there is still a method behind them. Once I stopped trying to improve upon Joly's method before I'd actually learned it, things went considerably better for me, as you will have seen. Although the book is aimed at creating florals in around 15 minutes, I don't think the time limit is really the most important part. For me, its strength lies in encouraging you to loosen up, work more instinctively and enjoy the movement of the brush. This book would be particularly useful for beginners or for anyone who feels intimidated by painting flowers and wants a simple way just to get started. More experienced watercolour painters may also enjoy it as a source of quick projects, warm-up exercises, or ideas for cards, bookmarks and other small painted pieces. As I mentioned at the very beginning of my review, Joly Poa is a watercolour artist and teacher with a large online following, and her relaxed, accessible teaching style comes through very clearly in her book. You can find more of Joly's work and tutorials online, and I will leave the relevant links in the description below. I really enjoyed trying something outside my usual landscape painting comfort zone, and by the end of the exercise, I had produced a painting I was pleased with. So yes, I do think 15-minute watercolour florals lives up to its promise. It's encouraging and practical and full of projects that make loose floral painting achievable. I'll leave links to the book along with Joly's website, social media and online classes in the description below. If you found my review helpful, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to ArtBookNook for more in-depth art book reviews and occasional practical tests. You can also support the channel by becoming a member, which helps me continue making these longer and more detailed reviews. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.